Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the launch of Unicef's tool for investors on integrating children's rights into ESG assessments. My name is Eric Nyman, and I sit in Unicef's Children's Rights and Business team in Geneva. I'm the person who led this work together with Marilu Gressens-Perez, our consultant, and I'll be your MC today. Just by way of introduction, we will be running this webinar for 1 hour. And if you have any questions for Unicef or the panelists, please post them in the Q&A function at the lower end of the Zoom link. And we will also share a recording of this webinar later online. So in case you have colleagues or partners that missed this, we will have a recording of the webinar. Now, we have a wonderful panel with us today, experts and colleagues in this work. So let me start by introducing our panel, starting with Carla Haddad-Mardini, the Director of Unicef's Division of Private Fundraising and Partnerships. Hi, Carla. And then we have Nikolai Halscher-Pedersen, Senior Specialist for Sustainable Markets at the Principles for Responsible Investment. Welcome, Nikolai. We have with us from Rockefeller Capital Management, Mia Overall, the Director of Shareholder Engagement. Thank you for joining, Mia. And from Sustainalytics, Tutti Kasinen, the Director of Engagement Services. Hey, Tutti. And we have Peter Paul de Vries, Chief of External Affairs for the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI. And last but not least, we have Filippa Bergin, Head of Research and Business Development at the Global Child Forum. And I also want to introduce Andrew Mawson, the Chief of Children's Rights and Business in Unicef, who will be doing the closing remarks. So thank you, big thanks to the panel and to everyone who's joined. Now, without further ado, let me give the floor to Carla Haddad-Mardini for the opening remarks. Carla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric, and it's a pleasure to see that we are 136 participants. This is great. It's really a pleasure for me to be with you today, and I would like to express our appreciation to the over 20 organizations that have provided feedback and suggestions on the initial draft of the tool. On behalf of the Executive Director of Unicef, Henrietta Fore, and everyone in Unicef and in the Unicef family. So why are children important to investors? Children make up 1/3 of the world's population. All businesses impact children in some way. And children are a key stakeholder for business, both in the present and in the future. This means that businesses cannot, by definition, not be sustainable. They cannot be sustainable unless they address their impact on children. UNICEF, together with the UN Global Compact and Save the Children, launched the Children's Rights and Business Principles in 2012 to translate international norms and standards on children's rights into business language and context. So businesses and investors are usually quite aware of child labor risks, but there are many more business impacts on children in the workplace, marketplace, and community. For example, workplace conditions for parents can have significant impact on children's development and well-being. Paid parental leave allows parents to securely bond with their babies, even fathers, as we see it now, in the first critical years of life, a time evidence tells us when the combination of the right nourishment, a loving environment, and stimulating care can strengthen a baby's developing brain and give her the best start in life. Not only do family-friendly policies pay off in healthier, better educated children, greater gender equality and sustainable growth, they are linked to better workforce productivity, and this is proven by evidence, and the ability to attract, motivate, and retain employees and talent. This example also shows that addressing child rights impacts are core to many other sustainability priorities, from women's economic empowerment to decent work and good ICT governance. The global COVID pandemic has hit children particularly hard, with many previous advancements at risk. And we speak of development reversals and not being able to reach the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. This also constitutes risks to business arising from children spending more time online, school closures across the world, and homeschooling. The COVID pandemic has, however, provided us with an opportunity to reshape the world for children and implement better policies and practices to ensure that children's rights are protected and respected. Business practices that respect the rights of children and parents, such as family-friendly workplace policies, are key to this. We hope that the tool for investors on integrating children's rights in ESG assessments that we are launching today with you will help investors to better integrate children's rights to their analysis and engagement with companies to improve child rights policies, practices, and disclosure. Investors have a crucial role in championing the shift towards better business practices for children, and we urge you to seize this opportunity and stand ready to work with you to achieve this. Towards this end, UNICEF is looking to work with champions within the investment world to take collective action to improve business practices on children's rights. As company disclosure on children's rights remains quite low, this will be our first priority for investor action. Before I hand the floor back to Eric to take us through the tool, I want to thank our panel of experts joining us today. And I look forward to your perspectives on children's rights in investment decision-making, disclosure, and data availability to analyze child rights due diligence. Thank you, and looking forward to this session. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Carla. We thought it would be useful, of course, to give you all a run-through of the tool and the key features of the tool. I'm unfortunately going to have to do this with slides because it's a lot of information, but bear with me. Just as a way of contextualizing this and why are children's rights important for investors, Carla mentioned this, that there are a lot of intersections, of course, between business and children's rights. UNICEF worked together with UN Global Compact and Save the Children in 2012, after the launch of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, to develop the children's rights and business principles, to basically guide companies and help them understand their impact on children, but also take action to address negative impact. This effort was very much about translating international norms and standards into the language and context of business. And this work has been continuing since 2012 with a number of guidance and tools and pieces around this area of work to inform businesses and also investors about how businesses impact on children. I would also like to mention the UNICEF and Sustainalytics investor guidance on integrating children's rights into decision making, which came out in 2019, which this tool that we're launching today very much builds upon. And Tutti Kassinen, who was the co-author of that, is a panelist on the panel today. Now, the tool for investors on integrating children's rights into ESG assessment was basically developed as a framework for assessing how companies manage and address risks to children. It's not creating any new expectations. We aren't seeking to issue new new standards or anything like this. This is about translating the existing standards into metrics that investors can use to assess company due diligence. We have based the indicators on existing frameworks like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the most widely ratified human rights instrument in the world, the UN Guiding Principles, of course, the OECD guidelines, and the Children's Rights and Business Principles, ILO conventions, etc. The tool was developed for institutional investors, asset owners, managers, and ESG researchers primarily, although there are potentially other use cases for this tool. But the idea is that the tool should give guidance to any user in terms of how to assess both whether children's rights are material within the investment process, as well as assessing the actual policies and performance of the company. We aim to make this very practical and adaptable, because we realize that all of these entities use very different systems to actually do their assessment. So we wanted to provide a framework that could be adapted into any context. And you'll see this, for example, when we talk about scoring. So the way that the tool is laid out, we start with a part that deals with materiality and salience. And it basically gives investors the guidance that they need to be able to assess materiality of child rights impacts in order to both weight the different indicators against other human rights indicators or sustainability indicators, for example, but also to pick the right indicators for the right types of companies. We give some guidance in the tool around which industries typically have a higher risk of certain types of child rights impacts, or which types of business activities might have a heightened risk to business context. For example, a company that employs a lot of female workers might have a higher risk around family-friendly workplace policies. Finally, the tool also gives a little bit of guidance referencing to the Unicef Child Rights Atlas on how to assess risk in different geographies, so in different countries. So this should give investors a good methodology to assess the materiality of children's rights for a company that they're looking to assess within the ESG assessment. The second part is really the core of the tool. It is the part that deals with assessment indicators. There are 36 indicators in the tool. We are not expecting that investors would use all 36 to assess all companies, and that's not appropriate. But we wanted to include indicators that would cover a diverse set of issues, so that companies can be assessed on their most salient or material impacts. And these are further broken down into themes, and I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide. We also are suggesting some exclusions, both some common exclusions that are commonly used, that also are very relevant for children's rights. Also introducing an exclusion that's not so commonly used, which is violation of the Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. It's a very core issue for children's rights. Then the final part deals with data collection and data sources, which is of course very important for investors in order to assess this. We're giving an overview of both the different frameworks that actually deal with these kinds of issues, as well as common sources of data. So just to take you through a little bit the design of the indicators. So as I said, we are structuring the indicators around two categories. The first category is general due diligence indicators, so child rights due diligence indicators that should be applicable to all types of companies. So they are in a way industry agnostic, and they look at the general children's rights policy and codes of conduct and things like this within the company. The second part deal with issue or function indicators. And these are indicators that would be applicable based a little bit on the context in which the company operates and the kind of activities the company is undertaking. So for example, we have indicators around child labor, which you would expect, but also decent work for young workers, decent work for parents and caregivers, the family-friendly workplace policies that Carla spoke of, child protection and safety, marketing to children, and environment and land use. So obviously these will not all be applicable to a single company, but they're meant to be picked for the companies where these issues are highly material. The way we propose scoring this indicator is in a 5-grade scale. As I said before, we tried to create a framework that will allow investors and asset managers and others to adapt this to their own systems. We have arbitrarily chosen 0 to 2 as the scoring scale here, with the half points in between. And the guidance is giving examples of what might constitute scoring according to this criteria. However, you could equally use a percentage-based scale or a 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, or however the investors' systems are set up. So a score of 2 means comprehensive management of children's rights impacts. It's a very high threshold. It is in a way aspirational, and this has to do with partially the fact that children's rights is always evolving, much like other sustainability issues, and we want to set quite a high bar to really show the companies that are leading. A score of 1 is meeting expected practice, and a score of 0, of course, is either no disclosure or no practice or policy. Just to show you what this looks like in practice, here is the indicator on parental leave. So here we have the indicator itself, which is, does the company provide sufficient paid maternity, paternity, and parental leave? The first column there on scoring speaks to the criteria for achieving the score of 2, 1, or 0. And the second column speaks a little bit more to the kind of factors that would come into assessing the score itself, with also some guidance on what half points might be awarded for. So this is what it looks like within the tool for all the 36 indicators. We also have in the section of data sources, as I mentioned, again, looking at parental leave, the kinds of frameworks that deal with this issue, as well as data sources with links to existing reporting frameworks where available. So for example, parental leave is reported in GRI 401-3. Finally, I would say invite you to go and look at the tool. I think Caleb posted a link in the chat, but here is the link to the tool. So I invite all investors to go through this, check it against your existing frameworks. I think you'll find that there are some of these issues that are not covered or that could be covered stronger for actually most investors. So we hope this really adds value to your assessment, and we hope that this enables you, as Carla said, to be part of this shift towards a more child-friendly world. So thank you very much. Stop sharing here. So to get this voice from the investor side, I'd like to start by inviting Nikolai from PRI. Nikolai, how are investors addressing their responsibility to respect human rights? And how can children's rights fit into this?
There we go. Now I'm unmuted as well. So thanks, Eric, and thanks to Unicef for hosting, and thanks for the invitation to the PRI. So in answering that question, I'm just going to start with a bit of context on ESG and a bit of history, because I think it helps us understand where we are now and how children's rights might fit within this concept of ESG, which means environmental, social, and governance factors. So if we go 15 years back, actually exactly this April is when the PRI was set up with a mission to contribute to the development of a more sustainable global financial system. So we're a membership organization for institutional investors. Today, we have more than 3,700 members with more than 100 trillion in asset under management. Now, why do I say this? That's because 100 trillion in asset under management constitutes the majority of global capital markets, which means we have a commitment by the majority of actors to address environmental, social, and governance factors, as I meant, and children's rights, and we'll come back to that, surely fits within this concept. So there's a few drivers which I think it's important to mention that has taken us to this point. First of all, there's an incredible push from beneficiaries or users of the financial system, citizens, us essentially, to look at these types of issues. Secondly, it's also being picked up by policymakers and regulators, and sustainability issues are increasingly reflected in the frameworks that investors need to conduct their activities within. So we've obviously seen with the Paris Agreement that there's a lot of policy activities to implement that, the Sustainable Development Goals, human rights more broadly as well. So this is definitely a trend underway. And then thirdly, in terms of drivers, also obviously the financial argument, the materiality argument. And I know you addressed this in your paper yourself, Eric, but this is obviously very closely connected to the other developments. This is not a static concept. it essentially means, materiality means that investors will be concerned with those issues and factors that might impact on their sort of risk return, the investment performance of portfolio companies. And so as these are, developing, and as the policy context, most importantly, are developing, we see these types of issues increasingly being recognized by investors as material. And I know you touch on this in your work as well. One important thing to mention here, though, is that when we understand human rights, and particularly with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it's obviously not only about risk to portfolios or risk to business, it's also about risk to people. And I think very few users of the financial system would accept that their pension savings or their savings in the bank were built on the back of investment or business activities that didn't recognize human rights. And I think nowhere is that more obvious than when we talk about children's rights. So let's not forget the normative side of things as well. That is an important piece of context, which clearly overlaps very strongly with the financial side. Just to touch very briefly on the regulatory developments, because I think this is important. We've certainly seen an exponential growth in terms of policy instruments, primarily with due diligence legislation, in certain instances, specifically on children's rights or child labor, as we've seen in the Netherlands. In a lot of instances, modern slavery. In France, it's a broad due diligence requirement on companies on human rights. And this is very much, let's say, growing. An important point to make here from an investment point of view is that we are not only seeing these regulations targeting companies, in some instances they also cover financial institutions, but we're actually also seeing it directly in financial regulation in Europe. So that is potentially the next frontier, which means that investors will be explicitly asked to consider these types of issues in their investment processes. So it obviously means there's a lot more attention from investors, and we broadly categorize activities of investors in 3 different groups at the PRI. There's obviously the capital allocation or investment side, screening, using benchmarks, evaluating risk and opportunity. There's the engagement side, and an important example to mention is BlackRock, who announced a policy just last month. And obviously with the size of BlackRock, that is important. And then thirdly, also the activities that investors do on policy. And we know there is a call from investors for more policy on human rights. So I'm just going to close off with a few thoughts in terms of the different groups that investors are looking at here. So it's broadly recognized that there is the workers' side, there's consumers or users, and there's communities. And obviously within these 3 groups, children figure in all 3 groups as a particularly vulnerable group that investors need to pay closer attention to. So I'd like to recognize the work of Unicef, because I think we're at a point now where the broad recognition of human rights is kind of seeping through the financial system, and investors recognize that, but we need to get much deeper in the understanding of the risks that we are exposed to and how the decision we make as investors can influence here. So just to conclude, the PRI, some might be aware, we've set out a precision paper on human rights last October, and we're very much committed to this agenda. We're working with our investors, both in terms of accountability, making sure that they improve their practices, but also with support programs to understand human rights very broadly. And as I said, we need to further the depth of understanding of human rights, and children's rights is obviously key here. So Eric, thanks very much for the time to make those comments, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. There's some excellent points there, and bringing in the regulatory piece. Many thanks for that. I'll move us swiftly on to Mia from Rockefeller. Mia, how can investors and asset managers better include children's rights within their investment activities? How can the UNICEF tool be useful in that respect? And maybe since Nikolai mentioned it, could you speak a little bit about the materiality versus saliency assessment within the work of an asset manager such as yours?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here today, and my applause to UNICEF for publishing this tool. And so just for context, so I lead shareholder engagement at Rockefeller Asset Management. We are an institutional investor, and we engage all of the companies in our global ESG strategy and many of our other strategies on a regular basis, for two reasons. One is because we know that these dialogues really help us as investors. They help us enhance our returns. And the other reason is that we find that it helps us catalyze positive change. And so, you know, when I read this tool, I was very appreciative. And, you know, the bottom line is that children's rights are something for investors to think about because it impacts our investments. And so what's great about this tool from my perspective is, you know, first and foremost, it really frames children's rights in the context of materiality on the one hand and saliency on the other hand, which are two, you know, distinct and yet very intertwined concepts. You know, ESG integrated investors, which is what we are at Rockefeller, often think largely in terms of materiality. And for many investors, this is really limited to, you know, what are the ESG issues that are likely to have a financially material effect on the stock, so on the stock price or on the performance of a company. Now, for investors that would refer only to the SASB materiality map, you wouldn't find human rights or children's rights flagged really as a material issue for a number of industries that that we know impact human and children's rights, such as agriculture, where parents would often take their children into the field, or in some cases where children would be, you know, picking fruits or vegetables or cotton in the field. Other industries such as electronics, recycling, manufacturing, recycling, where children are often separating materials because of their small fingers, or carpet weaving, or even apparel or sports manufacturing. And those of you who are my age or older will remember Nike getting slammed for child labor in the production of soccer balls. And so we know that this issue has been problematic for companies reputationally in the past. So in contrast to SASB, I think GRI's definition of materiality is, and I know we have GRI in the call, so this is a nod to you. GRI's definition is much more all-encompassing of these sort of realities, which is something that I've always appreciated about this broader definition and GRI's framework. Now, Unicef helpfully, I think, draws attention to this distinction through the juxtaposition of what is a salient issue versus what is a material issue, right? Also noting that saliency, you know, the impact on people and children, right, on their lives, can lead to financial materiality when a company faces boycotts or other reputational damage. So that's one thing that I think will be helpful for many investors, particularly those, you know, trying to determine, you know, where this fits into how they should view it, you know, whether you're an ESG integrated investor or sort of a SRI or a values-based investor. I think that distinction is really helpful. Another thing that I find very helpful about the tool is that it goes industry by industry and offers examples of known children's rights impacts and in each of those industries, and provides links to industry-specific guidance notes that Unicef has published. Unicef is a prolific publication of you know, children's rights issues across every industry. And so, you know, if you're an analyst with coverage of the food and beverage sector, or consumer goods sector, or, you know, or whatever sector, you can easily go to the sector that you're responsible for covering, see, you know, what are the most known children's rights impacts, what's most relevant for me to think about. And then turn to the second part of the toolkit, where Unicef outlines, you know, some more specifically, and this is what Eric pointed to in your opening slides, what are the specific things to look for to know just how seriously a company is taking children's rights. Do they have policies in place? You know, do they have a commitment to prohibit child labor? How good are these policies? Are they disclosing what they're doing to implement the policy? And then sort of sprinkled throughout, Unicef has all these examples of good practice on, things ranging from, labor in the supply chain to digital marketing and online protection, family policies, all these things. So, if you're an investor looking to evaluate how a company in a given sector stacks up in terms of its commitment to children's rights, you can go through the tool, figure out what the known risks are, look for the kinds of policies and disclosures that Unicef recommends as you're going through those companies' disclosures, and make a determination about how the company is doing. And then also, sort of if they're doing poorly, there's a clear framework in place for good practice that would allow any investors who are engaging companies to get on the phone with them and make specific recommendations. So that's what I like about the tool.
That's a lot. Thank you, Mia. You covered a lot of ground here. Let me just pick up one thing, and I'm very happy to see that clearly we managed to articulate the point that children are really everywhere. They're affected by business in many ways. They're part of many sustainability issues, and certainly key to solving some of the existing, maybe more prioritized sustainability issues as well. But also, if you don't specifically look for children, chances are you're going to miss them. Right? Thank you very much, Mia. We'll come back to this in the question and answer. And just on that, for participants listening, if you have questions to the panelists or to Unicef, please post them in the Q&A function, and we will have some time at the end to try and answer every question we get. Let's see how well we do with that. But in the interest of time, let me move on. So disclosure is obviously disclosure, data availability is obviously a big issue in this in terms of using this tool. So to start us off on a little discussion on that, I would like to invite Tutti from Sustainalytics to speak to a little bit to this issue. Now, Tutti, you've been working on the issue of children's rights with Investor for several years, right? And Sustainalytics actually was part of the development of this tool in conducting an assessment on children's rights due diligence across a sample of companies as part of the development of the Investor tool. Could you share some of your observations on this and any other thoughts on the issue? Tutti, the floor is yours.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, indeed. My work on children's rights and investor integration started in 2013 when we first cooperated with the Global Child Forum, actually, whom we'll hear from later, on surveying asset owners' approach to this topic. And in most recent years, it's been great to join forces with Unicef to issue the investor guidance in 2019, as Eric mentioned, and also now that we are taking other joint efforts to support investors with practical tools and workshops, hoping to help the advancements there. And what I would say is that underpinning this work has been our shared concern about children's rights being a potential blind spot in ESG assessments of both companies and investors, actually, and the obvious need for better understanding of children's rights issues beyond child labor. But we've also been spurred on by the clear interest and need from investors wanting more information about their role and about the risks and impacts related to children's rights, which is really encouraging. And I'm really pleased to see the number and engagement from investment industry actors increasing slowly but surely. And as I think most participants know, Sustainalytics is a research and engagement services provider for institutional investors. And as such, data and reporting is very much our thing. So as Eric said, during the development of the tool that we are talking about today, we supported in ensuring that the indicators within the tool capture measurable aspects of corporate reporting. And in that, our research team tested the initial 42 indicators against the reporting of 15 companies. And separately, we at Sustainalytics have also carried out bespoke research on children's rights when clients have been asking for it. So I will summarize some observations on the available data and company reporting based on these experiences. So on testing the tool indicators, a couple of months ago, we sampled 3 companies each from 5 industries most exposed to children's rights violations, with these being personal and household goods, food and beverage, technology, travel and leisure, and basic resources. And of these industries, it was the personal and household goods which generally performed best. In terms of reporting on different core indicators across industries, most companies scored well against the initiatives and partnerships indicator, and this was mostly due to the commonness of reporting on philanthropic efforts and collaborations with stakeholders such as children's rights NGOs. And the same applies to the indicator which ranked second, which focused on resources donated to social initiatives supporting children's rights, which is also widespread practice across companies in most industries. At the other end of the spectrum, companies across the board performed particularly poorly on the indicators addressing due diligence and parental leave. Overall, I'd say it's quite telling that despite our sample set centering on industries with the most exposure to children's rights issues and consisting of companies generally considered as having strong or medium disclosure, we still found that reporting on most child-related indicators is definitely lacking. And this is in line with our previous experiences on researching children's rights disclosure. We've often ended up making assumptions that human rights commitments might also cover children's rights because it's not usually been explicit. What we have noticed is that child labor is still companies' main focus when it comes to children's rights, and that's something that they explicitly do mention in their more overarching policies connected to human rights or supply chain, for example. And here we see progress with more companies' child labor statements covering both their own operations as well as the supply chain nowadays than was the case in the past. But still, while many companies are highly exposed to child labor risks, only a few mention that as a salient issue, and even fewer companies mention children's rights issues as salient. As expected, consumer-facing household names are and have been the company's best on children's rights disclosure, and especially with respect to reporting on their own operations. But still, even the leaders have clear disclosure gaps, such as those related to board oversight, due diligence, remedies, as well as policy on children's rights. And on the topic of policies, only a handful of companies that we've researched disclose a standalone policy on child labor, and we've only come across one company that has had a children's rights policy overall. On the other hand, we've noticed significant improvements on human rights reporting in general, and that's aligned to the overall positive trend on ESG disclosure, of course, which we've touched on, the earlier speakers have touched on as well. However, unfortunately, progress on children's rights reporting doesn't seem to have kept up with the enhanced human rights reporting, I'm sad to say. And what I would like to say is that while corporate disclosure doesn't always fully reflect companies' actual measures, our findings indicate that there may be significant gaps not only in reporting, but also in company preparedness to mitigate risks and impacts connected to children's rights. And likewise, whenever I talk about children's rights, I always highlight that children aren't only risks and victims, but they can also provide business benefits. And so the gaps that we are seeing in reporting could also be a sign of companies missing out on opportunities for them to benefit from products and services and policies aligning with the needs of children and their caregivers. Sorry, it's a bit doom and gloom, but to conclude, I just wanted to highlight that disclosure typically evolves in response to increased demand. And here investors have a really important role to play by engaging companies to better manage and report on their approach to children's rights. And hopefully with improving company disclosure and standardization, the availability and the quality of data will over time also enable more informed assessments and comparisons of companies between and across industries. So I really encourage investors to utilize the Unicef tool as a basis for active ownership with relevant companies, and hopefully that will contribute to more transparency, as well as, of course, companies improving their approach to children's rights.
Many thanks, Tutti, and lots of information, but I think highlighting the last point there of the importance of collective action, and this is certainly our assessment too, especially to improve disclosure on this important issue. Since we're talking about disclosure and disclosure standards and requirements, it's very appropriate that we have Peter Paul here from GRI. Peter Paul, maybe as a question, can you give us a sense of the current state of disclosure requirements on children's rights, and what can be done to improve this?
Thank you, Eric, for that question, and thank you for inviting us to discuss this essential topic. I've cut my speaking points a little bit because I want to make sure that we have time for the discussion and for the conversation of contribution of the Global Child Forum. So I'll keep it short, but I'll get to your question. But first of all, let me start by congratulating UNICEF on the launch of the tool. We have seen an increase in interest in the investment community, and we've heard about it from previous speakers in strengthening their understanding of ESG impacts and impacts of human rights and children's rights. So your tool is an important addition to their toolbox. So thank you and congratulations with that. For those of you who don't know, GRI is an independent international organization, and we provide a global common language for corporate transparency. Our standards are the most widely used reporting framework for organizations worldwide to understand and communicate their impacts on critical sustainability issues, including human rights. So as Mia, and thanks for that, Mia explained very clearly, our focus is on the impact on the external world rather than on the impact these issues might have on the financial health of an organization. Also important, but not the focus of the GRI standards. Over the past 20 years, we have been really committed to human rights agenda and children's rights as an important thread throughout our work. Eric highlighted one example, and there's plenty more in our standards. And we are very pleased to have this long-standing cooperation with UNICEF to strengthen and continue to strengthen our standards on that point. Because the infringement of any child's rights is a tragedy. The fact that children's rights are still not enshrined in law in many countries, and disreputable companies are profiting out of these infringements are just shocking. And they should remain on our agenda, and we should all push back hard on it. Business partners and consumers would be appalled in a lot of cases to find goods that they have used were made at the expense of children's well-being. The Nike example was mentioned, but I can name quite a few more that if people knew about it, it would change businesses. But thankfully, today, there's a growing global consensus that business and their owners, the investors, have a responsibility to respect children's rights. And the tools and insights developed by UNICEF, by the UN Guiding Principles, and the GRI standards can all help protect children and transform businesses. But currently, we at GRI are updating our universal standards, which will be released in September. And the objective of that exercise is to further strengthen and bring our standards even more closely in line with key authoritative intergovernmental instruments in this area, including UN Guiding Principles, the OECD guidelines, and the OECD due diligence guidance. And now, as of late, we are very closely engaged in and will take on board the learnings from the due diligence processes within the European Union. So the revised standards that we're working on will really embed mandatory human rights related disclosures at the heart. So before companies will get to the point that they need to do a materiality assessment, we are going to demand a significant amount of mandatory human rights reporting. And on top of that, the standards will lay more emphasis on reporting the effectiveness of the actions. It's not just that you have to report your impacts, but also address and outline how you see these actions that you're taking working as a company, and what lessons are you learning, and how are you taking those lessons back into your operational practices to further improve as a business. And then as a phase 2 of this project, we will update topic standards, which are specifically focused on human rights and children's rights, and further develop it as well. There is a scoping survey out, so if you go to our website and you have an opinion, please do and give your view and be part of our consultation in that respect. Now, let me close by actually answering your question, Eric. You asked, what's the current state of disclosure on human rights? And my answer would be, well, the tools are there. Both the strengthened GRI standards, as well as, for example, the new UNICEF tool, provide the means to report on children's rights impacts and for stakeholders, including investors, to really understand those impacts. However, the problem is that we see that a lot more work is needed related to the implementation of those tools, to make investors use those tools. But this is also where I can close on a positive note. We see a strong push in the UN, in the European Union, but also in other jurisdictions around the world for mandatory reporting. And in our mind, that is the way forward. Only if it becomes mandatory to report on these impacts and really think about it, will we make the kind of progress at the speed that's needed. Let me leave it at that for now.
No, many thanks, Peter Paul, and this is really important contributions. Thank you so much. We're running a little bit after time, so I won't say much about this, but rather hand over to Filippa from the Global Child Forum. Let me just say, I mean, we're very happy to have you here, both as a child rights expert, but also with a background within the asset manager industry. Filippa was the sustainability manager of Storebrand, the Norwegian financial services group, before she joined Global Child Forum. So it's great to have you here wearing two hats of sorts. Now, Filippa, the Global Child Forum has been conducting these benchmarking initiatives of the company child rights due diligence for the past 11 years. So there is clearly data here. And what can you tell us about the overall findings of these studies, and how can investors access this data?
Well, thank you, Eric. But may I first congratulate you and Mary Lou to launching this very important project today. We really support your effort and we appreciate what has been going into the project as you launched it. May I ask you to show my slides? Thank you so much. Well, as you said, I come from Global Child Forum, and Global Child Forum is an organization that was actually founded by the Swedish royal family, and our purpose is to support and influence global multinational to take a more strategic approach to managing children's rights. We issue guidance. For example, last week we issued the child participation guideline, which sought a lot of interest from the technology sector. But we also do a benchmark study. So during the past 10 years, or actually 11, we have assessed approximately 2,600 global companies. We use public information, but we harvest it ourselves. So we don't have to rely only on what is being reported in sustainability reports. We can also harvest other public information from the websites of the companies. And the benchmark study is based on the children's rights and business principles. And as we've heard here today, we try to represent the perspectives of workplace, marketplace, community, and environment. We also try to look at the entire kind of value chain in the company, starting out from the policy framework, going through implementation to reporting to actual impact. And one of the most important things that we try to see is how well companies actually manage to increase the positive impact of their core business, because as been mentioned here, normally there is a focus on child labor. So we've done the study for several years, and last year we did a focus on Southeast Asia, where we covered 270 companies. We saw some interesting results in the tech and telecom industry, where telecom came out as really far along in terms of protecting children's rights and really interested in child participation. Whilst technology lagged behind, far behind. I saw a comment here from one of the participants talking about how technology companies are integrating children into their human rights practices, which is really good. If I may ask you to just pick back to this previous slide. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to mention that we make this data available starting this year for investors. So we haven't focused on making it available before, because our focus has been on the actual companies. But to this audience today, we just want to clarify that we can make the individual company scorecards available as well as the entire data set. It may be used in different ways. You can use it for stock picking. You can use it perhaps to further inform your engagement practices when using the tool that's been launched today. And you may even use it to create different types of indices. So next slide, please. And all this information is also given to the companies that are part of the benchmark. So this is a scorecard that you see where the company gets their own results and they are compared to their peers and the entire data set. So if you are presently involved in speaking to one of these companies, feel free to ask for this scorecard. This year, we're focusing on the universe that's been identified by the World Benchmarking Alliance. They have a group of corporations called the SDG 2000. So this year we're doing the survey on 1,000 companies, and we're inviting the additional 1,000 companies to do a self-assessment, and they too get to compare themselves to all peers. So next slide, please. So why would you want to access this data? I think I'm preaching to the choir right now that we are all very much in agreement that children's rights companies have an effect on children, and children have an effect on companies. But when I joined the organization, which I did a year ago, we wanted to do a correlation study to what we had actually found. So we have been doing this study for 10 years, but what is it that we know using our data? We're following the normative background that was described, but is there anything in particular that we found? So what we did was that we bought external data. We bought it from Sustainalytics, actually. And one of the things we saw was that there was a very high correlation between our general sustainability assessment and Sustainalytics ESG risk. So we were approximately in agreement on the companies that we assessed. But we also tried to see whether there was any kind of financial effect of what we found. So we assessed the company years ago. We thought that they were doing well in terms of children's rights or poorly. What happened to their profit margins? And we saw that there were higher profit margins for child rights, the ones that we assessed as top of the line, even when we cleaned out the data for other things like, for example, general sustainability. We also saw, this may be counterintuitive, but for the higher and best performance child rights implementing companies, higher reported incident of human rights violations and even child rights violations. We're not talking about causality, of course, but we saw correlation. And there may be a number of reasons to explain this. Better performed companies, better managed companies make higher profit, or the work on children's rights is often spurred on by different kind of problems, like, for example, when you have already been involved in alleged violations. So all this is food for thought and interesting discussions. And if you could just switch to the next slide, please. I just wanted to say that as we are opening up as of this year for sharing our data, feel free, if you want to access our data, to contact us. You can do it via mail to me, but everything is also available on our webpage. So we're just saying very welcome, and we hope for further discussions going forward. Thanks so much, Eric.
No, many thanks, Philippa. And we do really, we mentioned the benchmark in the tool as well. And it is a data source for investors that has already compiled data on not exactly the same indicators, but many indicators are very similar, especially in the due diligence side. So there is a data source here that's ready. So encourage investors to reach out to Global Child Forum to access this data. Now that brings us to the end of our presentation or panel part of the discussion. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. We have a couple of additional ones in the chat. We're not going to be able to answer all of this. We might only get to one or two. And some of them are would require quite an extensive discussion. Maybe I'll just pick up the first one from Imke Malman, which is, would you recommend to exclude any sectors that contribute to violation of children's rights? This is a section in the tool, and the sectors that we are proposing to exclude or proposing to consider to exclude are what you would expect for children's rights. It's tobacco, alcohol, weapons, etc., as well as violators of the marketing of breast milk substitutes code. These are core business activities that have a very high risk of harm to children. But I would like to leave that open to the panel. Is there anything that maybe Mia would like to add on this in terms of exclusions and children's rights, or anyone else for that matter?
Yeah, I think you covered it, Eric. I mean, I would defer to you in some regards, and I would also add that, you know, one thing that we will look for is, you know, supply chains that are particularly risky for certain topics in countries that are known to have violations of children's rights.
Thank you, Mia. Anyone else in the panel want to come into this? No. Let me highlight a question from Tracy Rembert, an affiliated investor. And Tracy gave us 3 questions that are all very good and very big questions. But I'll pick up the last one. Have children's rights been highlighted at the stock exchange level? What about with key trade associations representing companies facing higher levels of intersection with children's rights? Maybe this is a good question for potentially you, Peter Paul. Do you see any industry associations, for example, picking up the issue of children's rights clearly?
What I see is more on the stock exchange side, where we see a general increase in requirements for full ESG disclosure, including human rights and children's rights. I haven't, but that's also, I haven't paid too much attention necessarily to the details of that. But I don't know if it's children's rights only, but I see in general more stock exchanges requiring extensive ESG disclosure as part of their listing requirements.
Thank you very much, Peter Paul. I saw Philippa also had a comment on this. Philippa?
Yes, I had 2 comments. Well, first of all, as we see that there are higher profits associated with companies that do really well and strategically manage children's rights, we were thinking that children's rights is kind of the next climate issue, and that it should be very valuable to focus on this from, for example, stock exchanges. But I did want to mention that we saw a lot of interest in our child participation guideline from the tech sector. Both ITU and GSMA independently contacted us. So I think there is an interest, perhaps because of what we've seen in terms of EdTech and teaching during COVID.
Yeah, thank you, Philippa. I think that's something that we have seen also from the Unicef side, quite close engagement with a lot of industries in the ICT sector. Sadly, we are coming very close to the end of this webinar, but it has been very rich. So thank you to all the panelists so much. You brought a lot of valuable insights to this. As a final word from me, I'll say that I hope that investors will use this tool and you will find it useful. Please do feel free to get in touch with Unicef if you want additional guidance or advice on this. We'll do what we can. To close us off, let me invite Andrew Mawson, the Chief of Children's Rights and Business in Unicef, to maybe not summarize the discussion. I think that will be difficult in the 2 minutes we have left, but to give some closing remarks. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I think we hope we're all emerging or beginning to emerge from the pandemic. In some parts of the world, perhaps more quickly than others, and we know that there will be a lasting impact. But I think one of the things we've very graphically seen over the last year and a half is things that we already knew, but which have been, in a sense, rubbed into our faces really very, or brought up right in front of our faces very, very directly and very visibly. One is the interdependence of the public and the private sectors, the way that the private sector has depended upon, in many places, on incredible amounts of support from governments and the general public in terms of being able to sustain, to survive, to retain workers, and the way that retaining workers and good conditions of work, as well as the innovation and the massive contribution of industry to finding solutions to the pandemic, have been absolutely essential. So I think, and one of the things that we have been struck by, I think, over something which I personally found counterintuitive initially, was the way that discussions around responsible business, sustainable business practice within the broader frameworks of sustainability haven't gone away over the last 12 months. They've actually magnified, intensified, and actually grown. And I think as we're looking ahead and thinking about the so-called building back better, or the Great Reset, or all of these other kinds of expressions that are being used to the kinds of society that we want to be building, the issue about responsible conduct, and within that the practical visibility of children's issues in due diligence and ESG and related areas is something, I think, of a real significant concern, where there is significant interest. It is, however, a work in progress, as many have said in this panel. It's one that UNICEF is deeply committed to. We are, however, extremely encouraged by the direction of travel, by the level of interest among businesses, amongst investors, amongst governments, and we see a real kind of intensification around these kinds of issues. Having the practical tools to actually help people recognize what business impact on children is, be able to have some clarity on what to report on, is a really fundamentally important thing. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today, Meer Overal, Tutti Cassinen, Peter Vol van de Wies, Nicolai Helscher, Philippa Bergen, for their presentations, insightful, and also thank you for the kind words about the tool itself. Many of you have been involved in helping develop it, so also take a pat on the back on it. Many thanks to the organizations that I think has been already mentioned who have offered insights and views in the consultations. Around 20 different organizations did so. Many thanks to all of you who have joined the webinar and stayed with us through this. I hope you found it interesting. This is by no means the last word on children and ESG. By no means. It's a step along a long journey. So this tool is something which we really want to have feedback on. We want to have, we want you to use it. We want you to identify where it's strong and tell us about this. Tell us where it's weak and it's not working. This is the kind of practical input we would very much want to hear from you about. Our door is open. Finally, let me thank Eric and Mary-Lou, who were the primary authors, building on work also done by Sustainalytics in the past, for the tool itself. And with that, I'd like to say, have a very good rest of the day, and please get out there and implement.
Thank you. And with that, we will close the meeting. Thank you to all the participants, speakers, and future viewers online. Bye-bye.